We have had yet another price hike in graphics cards. Anyone that has an RX card is selling it, and anyone looking to buy them is paying nearly 3 times what they originally bought for. So to get you playing all the latest games in the meantime, this is the best graphics card you can buy in 2018. This right here is the GTX570, and right now you might be thinking, I'm going insane, I'm reviewing a Fermi card and calling it the best card in 2018. And it's definitely a few years old now, but this card is not only cheap, but supports all the way up to DirectX 12, so what is actually powering this amazing GPU? Well, it's based on the GF110 variant of the Fermi 2 architecture, which fixed many of the issues found with the previous 400 series, such as getting hot enough to actually cook an egg. It comes with a core clock of 730MHz, 480 CUDA cores, and 1.2GB of GDDR5 VRAM, which comes clocked in at 1900MHz. It supports all the way up to DirectX 12, as the Fermi architecture is still receiving updates to this day, although for the most part these are only bug fixes and not optimizations like the latest GPUs. And here is the best part. It retails for as low as £27 or $35. However, in the US the GTX 580 may work out as a better deal, as getting it at $35 does seem to be harder than it used to be. So, it turns out that this is quite an available card in most countries, including Europe, as there were quite a few available, but you will have to look depending on location, especially for something with this level of power. It comes in at around GTX1050 levels of performance and can surpass it with an overclock, but do keep in mind that the GTX950 can also overclock as well. So, there is one downside to it. The graphics card does use 200 watts under full load, but you can always undervolt it to negate that bit, as people have had decent levels of success by purely dragging the sliders down a bit in MSI Afterburner. But for the most part, 200 watts isn't actually that bad, it's not too difficult to power, and it's really not going to make that much of a difference to your power bill. And for a GPU from 2010, that isn't half bad, especially with how well it's aging. The card we have here is one of the nicer variants, with the KFS variant, featuring not only a lovely cooler, but has a blue LED, something that I wouldn't have expected to see on a GPU of this age, and it was used by a CAD designer before I bought it off eBay, as they had pretty much the power of a GTX 580, but many people found them undervolting a whole load better. So realistically there isn't exactly much reason not to like this card. They are pretty easy to find as well, as a lot of companies are actually getting around to upgrading their CAD machines, so here on the UK market you're pretty easily going to find one of these. In the US it's also very easy, and in Europe, if you look locally, chances are you will find one. Nvidia's Fermi architecture originally lost to most of AMD's offerings on release, as shown by the HD 5870. But compute-based architectures generally age better, and when you pair this with Nvidia's continued support for the Fermi series, it seems to be coming out on top in a lot of recent titles, with it still being able to power through most games with admirable settings, especially compared to that of the AMD Terascale series. You won't get any of the bells and whistles like shadow play support, but value really seems to be the thing here with this card, as it's second to none, and with the HD 770 having risen to this price, unless you're really worried about power consumption, the GTX 570 is the new king of price to performance. I did manage to get a pleasant overclock on memory to around 850MHz on core and 2100MHz on memory. Nothing particularly special, and only around a 5% increase at that. But in general, this didn't change performance too much, so generally stock and overclock settings here aren't going to make much of a difference, as generally this card seems to run at slower clocks than most of the commercial cards, which seem to run closer than this 850MHz mark. Anyways, if you were willing to pump some more voltage into it, you could get higher, but anyway, let's just get this thing put back together and put into the system ready to be benchmarked. So with that all done, I've decided to test all of today's most popular games with the settings I found most playable. All gameplay shown has been a capture from the card exactly, so you guys can see exactly how it performs. And let's get on with some gaming. First up, with the most popular game around, we have PUBG in 1080p with a mixture of low and medium settings, giving decent visual fidelity while not hurting the frame rate too much. It was fully playable, and we went through a few matches with the card and I found no issues with playability at all. Sure, it wasn't ideal as my usual card, but that thing also costs 8 times more than this. The averages stayed around 47 FPS, but could drop to 1% lows of 39 FPS and 0.1% lows of 32 FPS when there was a lot going on. Although this was infrequent, and do factor in that this does also include the bit in the plane where FPS seems to tank on most older cards. Second to this, I tested Fortnite, which uses the exact same engine but runs much better. Once again in 1080p with medium and high settings this time, we saw a return of 70 FPS on average, which was great, especially with those decent frame times to boot. For some reason though, setting all options to high would make the game refuse to load in some textures in high quality, so I just opted for a nice mixture of medium and high settings, which gave us the best experience possible. This was taken from a full match, and as you can see, the game ran absolutely fine with these settings and never once stopped being playable. There was a couple of seconds though when loading into the game where the 0.1% lows could be seen, but this was promptly over and nothing to worry about. GTA 5 is also still very popular, so while running the game with high settings in 1080p, we saw 83 FPS on average, and you could increase the settings further. This is with textures on high, as I've noticed the VRAM limit in GTA 5 seems to be incredibly inaccurate as compared to how much it actually uses. So it ran fine on our 1.2GB of VRAM, something that most people would see as an issue, but realistically, I haven't seen this yet as a limit for a card of this power, although in those newer titles maybe you'll notice an issue. Realistically though, in most of these games it hasn't become much of a problem, as games like GTA 5, as you can see, including our frame times, we rarely saw any issues. Fallout 4 is a relatively recent game that runs completely fine with medium and high settings, and the card saw a virtually constant 60 FPS, but when stress testing the card through the cities, we didn't actually see much of a difference from this. When going through most of the game, it was a constant 60 FPS, as I've said, but in the cities there was a sort of drop down to the 56 FPS average and the 0.1% lows due to the game having to load in constant details in the distance when there was massive gunfights going on, but that was only momentary and didn't seem to last very long as the game shot back up to 60 FPS. CSGO was what I would call perfect. While running at 1080p with low settings and shadows set to high, because apparently that's how people play the game, with a very high average frame rate of 199 FPS, 111 FPS 1% lows, and 64 FPS 0.1% lows, never once dipping too far below the playable average. In fact, the game was absolutely fine in the entire time playing, and this was in the deathmatch mode. If you're in a competitive environment, you'd like to see a higher FPS due to the reduced player count, and you could likely up the resolution or up the settings and still play the game absolutely fine. For some reason, you guys keep asking to see this as a benchmark, so we have everyone's favourite football game with FIFA 18 running perfectly fine with 87 FPS on average, with the high option selected and no MSAA enabled. Perfectly smooth for me, however the cutscenes once again are locked down to 24 FPS, which may bring down those frame times. Even so, the game was perfectly playable, and you can probably turn up the MSAA if you want, or use the in-game's optional FPS cap if you want to cap the FPS to a constant 60 FPS. The only real experience I could find to rival CSGO was Metal Gear Solid 5 running in 1080p with most of the options set to high and a few of the options, well, pretty much just anti-aliasing, set to medium. But the game was absolutely great. It had some of the best frame times I've ever seen, as you can see by the actual gameplay, as it pretty much stuck to the 60 FPS cap the entire time, dipping once down to 59 FPS, I think every 100 frames, so that's definitely not bad. So I can't fault the game's performance here, or the card's performance with it either, as this game is incredibly well optimized, and the card just powers straight through it. Moving on to something a little bit more intensive with, 4K benchmark, something that you don't usually see on a card at this age, we have Skyrim, which is running fine. We didn't have any anti-aliasing enabled as the game was already sharp enough and looking great, but with medium and high settings, the game looked brilliant and I can't fault the experience at all, and I had no idea the game would run this well in 4K, with averages of 55 FPS and 46 FPS and 32 FPS as our respective 1% and 0.1% lows. Up next in the 4K tests was Minecraft running absolutely fine in the 4K resolution with a texture pack and some fancy ass shaders. We saw a very playable frame rate of 58 FPS, which was pretty much fluent throughout the entire time playing. It did of course drop when loading, but nothing too badly for this game, with the 0.1% loads down 7 FPS, causing a little bit of stutter, but that's sort of to be expected with the Java engine, in which case you could always drop the resolution or remove the shaders to help this, but either way it's sort of just commonplace with a game like this. And finally, our last benchmark with Super Mario Galaxy 2 running on the Dolphin emulator, which scored a nice 60 FPS on average, while running in the 1080p resolution and using the DirectX 11 renderer, as that offered us the best performance, and this card unfortunately does not support Vulkan, but you can use the DX12 renderer if you use an older version of Dolphin. Not that it would actually work any better. Synthetically, it comes in with a score of 4,433 in Firestrike, which is pretty great considering that's about the same as the GTX950, which costs over 2.5 times more than this card. Unfortunately though, it doesn't actually qualify for your VR gaming needs, scoring a rather measly 2,408, which equates to 52 FPS on average, which is brilliant if you want a headache, and not so great if you actually want to game in VR, but I don't know why you'd be buying this card to game on VR anyway, I just thought it would be a nice test to run. So anyways, it comes in between the GTX 950 and GTX 1050 in terms of performance, which isn't half bad considering how cheap this card is. Do keep in mind that those cards not only use less power, but do overclock way higher, so will surpass it in performance if you do overclock them. So to conclude, the GTX570 is the one card I haven't wanted to take out of my system since it arrived. My only complaint is the power consumption, but in terms of actual usage this isn't actually that bad, and you can pick up a power supply unit off eBay for around £15, which would be more than enough to handle one of these things with an overclock. Performance is fine, and I did play all the latest games on this machine, including those like PUBG, which ran absolutely fine, especially when you're playing with friends, so you can enjoy a couple of games with your friends. In all honesty, you can play those older titles in full HD with high settings, or even 4K depending on how old they actually are. The main downside is that you won't have access to those Vulkan-based titles, but you can still play all those games that rely on the DX12 API, and even then, the performance is still pretty good. They're £27 over here in the UK and really common on eBay or CEX, and in the US they seem to be a little bit more expensive, and I've been told that you may as well grab a GTX 580 over there, as those go quite cheap as well. However, if you find one, I highly recommend the GTX 570, and the GTX 580 doesn't look too bad either if you come across one of those, but I have yet to review one myself. Personally, I've loved using this card and I can't recommend it enough. Thank you very much for watching, good night. So this card is perfect for those of you looking to get into PC gaming on the cheap, for its performance and a great price. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in another tech video.